a mother, 37 years old, a U.S. citizen, shot dead in the street by a federal agent in the United States of America. Pause on that fact. This is not a rumor, not a distant headline, not a story from some collapsing state. This happened here. Now, on American soil, for years, you were told something very specific, that harsher immigration enforcement would bring safety, that cruelty, if aimed at others, would protect everyone else. That promise collapsed the moment Renee Nicole Good was killed. What followed was not silence. It was eruption, protests across cities, communities in shock, a country asking uncomfortable questions. Because once force is normalized, it does not stay contained. Power does not know how to stop itself. If this story makes you uneasy, good. It should. Stay with me. Share this. Because to understand what comes next, we must first understand how we got here. What happened in Minneapolis is not an isolated tragedy. It is a signal that something deeper is breaking inside institutions, inside the promise of public safety itself. The killing of Renee Nicole Good forces us to confront a hard truth. Immigration enforcement is no longer only about borders. It has become a domestic force, armed, unaccountable, embedded in everyday life. You see it in the patrols on city streets. You feel it in communities living under constant fear. And you hear it in the language coming from the top. Officials did not pause. They did not reflect. They did not de-escalate. Instead, they attacked. They smeared the victim. They blamed the press. They doubled down. That reaction matters more than any single statement because it reveals how power now responds to error. Not with restraint, but with denial. To understand why this response was almost inevitable, we need to look backward at how policy, rhetoric, and fear slowly fused into a system. And that story begins long before this shooting. To understand this moment, we have to rewind. Not days, not months, years. Over time, immigration enforcement stopped being narrow. It stopped being specific. It stopped being limited. What began as border control slowly expanded inward from the edges of the country, into cities, neighborhoods, daily life. Language changed first. Immigrants were no longer described as people. They became threats, invaders, criminals by default. Policy followed rhetoric, broader authority, fewer restraints, more weapons, more presence, and crucially, fewer consequences. The system learned a dangerous lesson. Force works. Escalation is rewarded. Doubt is punished. Each cycle reinforced the next. Fear justified power. Power produced more fear. This is how institutions drift, not overnight, but incrementally, quietly, until a line is crossed. The killing of Renee Nicole Good was not an accident in isolation. It was the outcome of a long process. A system trained to act first and explain later. To see what happens when that system finally collides with reality, we need to examine the first breaking point. The first rupture came fast, and it came violently. A routine encounter, a federal agent on patrol, a civilian in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Within seconds, a life was gone. Renee Nicole Good was dead. A mother, a citizen, killed by the very system claiming to protect order. This was the moment abstraction collapsed. Policy became flesh. Rhetoric became blood. And the country reacted. Minneapolis erupted first, then cities far away, Asheville, Cleveland, Boston, New York, people flooded the streets, not in chaos, but in clarity. Signs were simple. Stop ICE. ICE out of our communities. What terrified people was not only the killing, it was the response. ICE agents kept patrolling as if nothing had happened. as if the system could not even pause to breathe. This was the first true crisis because it exposed something fundamental. The machinery did not malfunction. It operated as designed, and once that realization set in, the questions became far more dangerous. To answer them, we have to look beneath the surface. What sits beneath all of this is not chaos, it is structure. A system built to prioritize action over judgment, force over discretion, speed over accountability. When enforcement becomes a measure of political strength, restraint looks like weakness, and hesitation becomes failure. Inside that logic, escalation is normal. Pulling back is dangerous. Admitting error is impossible. This is how institutions protect themselves, not by correcting mistakes, but by denying them. Language plays a role. If someone is labeled a threat, then force feels justified before facts arrive. Oversight fades quietly. Responsibility blurs. Individual decisions dissolve into the system. And when harm occurs, the response is automatic. Deflect, attack critics, reframe the victim, not because every individual is malicious, but because the mechanism rewards loyalty to power, not loyalty to truth. This is why apologies never come, why questions provoke anger, why doubling down feels safer than reflection. Once you see this mechanism, you see why the crisis did not end with one death. Because systems like this do not self-correct. They escalate, and soon the consequences become impossible to contain. The second crisis did not arrive with a single gunshot. It unfolded in real time. After the killing, something critical could have happened. Silence, reflection, restraint. Instead, the opposite. Top officials stepped forward, not to calm the nation, but to inflame it. The victim was attacked, her character questioned, her death reframed. The video was replayed, shared again, as if repetition could dull its meaning. Press questions were treated as hostility. Basic facts were called lies. Doubt itself became the enemy. This was escalation without force. Power asserting itself through narrative, through intimidation, through gaslighting. And people noticed, because when authority refuses accountability, trust collapses fast. Communities did not feel protected. They felt hunted, watched, expendable. This was the second breaking point, not because of what officials said, but because of what they refused to acknowledge. At that moment, the crisis stopped being about one city or one agency. It became about legitimacy. And once legitimacy cracks, everything built on it begins to shake. Now, bring this down to the most human level. To you, because systems do not fall on paper, they fall on people. If you live in these communities, you feel the shift immediately. You change how you move, how you drive, how you look at flashing lights. You wonder who is watching and why. You tell your children to stay close, to stay quiet, to avoid attention. Not because they did something wrong, but because the rules feel unstable. This is what fear looks like in daily life. Not panic, but calculation. And that fear spreads beyond immigrants, beyond borders. When a U.S. citizen can be killed and then publicly smeared, the message is clear. Safety is conditional. Rights are fragile. And protection depends on power. If this story hits you emotionally, it's because it should. Talk about it. Share it. Refuse to normalize it. Because silence is how systems like this survive. And what happens next will not stay confined to one community. What is happening now does not stop at America's borders. It never does. When a country normalizes force at home, the world notices, allies watch closely. So do rivals. They see how power is used, how dissent is treated, how truth is bent under pressure, America has long claimed moral leadership, not perfection, but restraint, rules, accountability. Moments like this weaken that claim because when federal agents patrol cities like occupying forces, the language of democracy sounds hollow abroad. Authoritarian governments take notes. They point and say, this is what you do too. The damage spreads quietly through diplomacy, through trust, through influence, and internally the pressure builds. Protests trigger more enforcement. More enforcement fuels more anger. A feedback loop forms. Domestic instability feeds global doubt. Global doubt feeds domestic insecurity. This is how local crises scale up. Not through invasion, but through erosion. To understand where this trajectory leads, we have to look forward, not emotionally, but structurally. So let's talk about the future. Not as prediction, but as possibility. There are three paths from here. The first is reform. Pressure holds. Oversight returns. Limits are restored. Force is narrowed. Accountability becomes real. Trust slowly is rebuilt. This is the best outcome. And it requires sustained attention, not outrage alone, but persistence. The second path is stagnation. Nothing truly changes. Investigations drag on. Rhetoric softens. Practices remain. The system absorbs the shock and continues. This is the most likely scenario. Because institutions are designed to survive criticism, not transform from it. The third path is escalation. More force, more normalization, more deaths framed as necessity. Fear becomes policy, power becomes defensive, and legitimacy erodes further. History shows this pattern clearly. Systems either adapt under pressure or they harden. There is no neutral ground. Which path emerges depends less on leaders and more on what society refuses to accept. And that brings us to the final question. What do you do with this moment? This moment will pass from the headlines. They always do. Another story will replace it. Another crisis, another distraction, but the system exposed here will remain unless it is challenged. What happened to Renee Nicole Good was not inevitable. It was permitted by language, by silence, by normalization. The most dangerous lie in politics is that nothing can change. History moves when ordinary people refuse that lie. When they insist on limits, on accountability, on humanity, you don't need to agree on everything, but you do need to recognize this. A state that cannot restrain its power will eventually turn that power inward. Pay attention, talk about it, question official narratives, support those demanding oversight, because democracy does not collapse in one dramatic moment. It erodes quietly, incrementally, and once people accept fear as normal, it becomes permanent. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, share it. Stay engaged and keep asking the uncomfortable questions because the future is not decided yet, and it never is.